Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. I am in Montana. I am currently sitting in my niece's bedroom doing this podcast. Spoke with the authors last weekend, and now I'm finally able to edit. I've been traveling and doing various things, and so now, like I said, I'm sitting in my niece's bedroom in Montana, and oh my gosh, my sister and brother-in-law sure know how to pick good spots to build their houses because they always find the best views. This one is no different. This is the first time I've been to this house since they moved and built a new house, and just mountains everywhere. Mountains still have snow on them. I love Montana. I'm sure you longtime listeners already know this about me. I love Montana. I love my family. So I'm pretty much in seventh heaven right now, getting to have both. And I've gotten just spoiled rotten by my nieces, which is fun. I feel bad because I'm not spoiling them. But yesterday, my 10-year-old niece chose my outfit and did my hair and painted my nails. She was going to do my makeup, but got distracted and did not do that. That's okay. And then today again, she chose my outfit and did my hair. She said she just loves brushing my hair. It's so soft. I just love brushing her hair. So my hair has been brushed more in the last 2 days than it's been brushed. I mean, it's not like I don't brush it, but wow, she has brushed my hair a lot. At any rate, that is not what I am here to talk about today, but I am here to talk about books. And as I said, last weekend I spoke with authors Ehsan and Shakil Ahmad. They are brothers. They have written 2 science fiction books in their Wild Sun series. We talked about both. I was sent the second one, which is called Unbound. And let me give you the description of Unbound. Actually, first, let me give you the description of Wild Sun, because it makes sense to start at the beginning of the series. So that description is as follows. On a world enslaved, the last embers of hope are fading into an unrelenting darkness. Conquered and broken, the natives are forced to ravage their own lush planet of its natural resources, all for the glory of a mysterious empire they've never seen and barely comprehend. But not all light is lost. In the heart of one young woman alone, the gods have set a flame that cannot be extinguished. Sirin remains as fierce and unyielding as the planet itself, and her chance to strike is fast approaching. Above the skies of her home world, soldiers in the Empire are welcoming their new civilian commander, a vicious nobleman blinded by hidden ambitions. When the new face of darkness turns its eyes on Sirin, the fate of countless worlds will change forever. And so that, I really emphasized that forever at the end, didn't I? So that is the description of Wild Sun. That is the first book in the Wild Sun series. The second is called Unbound, and I'll give you the description of that a little later on in the podcast. What I like about, I like a lot of things about the series. I like that it is told not just from Sirin's point of view, but also from a character named Sonus, and that evil overlord, as if you want to put it that way, Count Talazir, and so it's told from his perspective as well. So you get multiple POVs from these different characters, and so you not only get the enslaved point of view from Sirin and Sonus, but then you get a point of view from the Empire as well, and that's not often the case. And so it's not to make you try to sympathize or empathize, with one side over the other, but maybe try to understand what's going on from both points of view, which isn't always the way books happen. And so I appreciated that Shakil and Ehsan took the time to write it from different points of view and to give those different perspectives so that we as the readers get a more full understanding, a clearer view of the story in general, because of course it is science fiction. It takes place on a different planet. There's a whole different world that we are inhabiting, and so to understand several different viewpoints of that world and what is happening on that world, I think is really helpful. So let's go ahead now and turn to the interview so the Ahmad brothers can tell you more about their story, their inspiration for the story, writing together, etc. So here is the interview with Ehsan and Shakil Ahmad about their Wild Sun series.
Ehsan and Shakil, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks,
I am
Sarah.
very
Great
happy
to be here.
Yeah, I'm very happy to have you both with me. We are going to talk about your Wild Sun series. Before we get to the books, though, if you want to share a little bit about yourselves, that would be great, and you can do that, individually as a team, however you want to do that.
I'll kind of take the reins and I'll just hand it off to Ehsan. So Ehsan and I both live in Brooklyn, New York. We happen to be also both born in Queens, but we weren't really raised there. Raised in the Northeast, the Philadelphia area, and then we kind of came back to New York in the past, decade or so. And son of Pakistani immigrants that came here about 40 years ago to Jackson Heights, and as it pertains to me specifically, we're both not classically trained writers, and perhaps we'll get into the story about how we even came to create the Wild Sun kind of universe at this point. But we had a huge kind of affection for film in particular, and Ehsan has more of a kind of like art background that he'll get into. I kind of have a background in the social sciences with a degree in psychology, and always fascinated by generally this grand human experiment that's playing out before us. And I think storytelling is one of the best tools to try and kind of figure out all of that. I know that's kind of a weird intro to myself. Ehsan, I'll hand it off to you for your end of things.
No, I mean, it's, I think, about right from a general perspective. We've just always been interested in storytelling. That's what got us into writing. We're brothers, obviously, if you didn't detect that already. And I think that helped us develop a shorthand to be able to work together. I think probably early on, it would have been difficult for us to collaborate because, we were kind of finding ourselves and our own identities. In how, our sort of the distinct lives we were carving out. But later in our 20s, we started to get a little bit more mature about creation and creating something, and then got a little smarter about how to work together and utilize our overlapping interest and shared history to be able to create, something unique creatively. And that turned into the Wild Sun series. So I think that's a relatively decent overview. Are we missing something pretty glaring here, Sarah, that you think we should mention?
Really, it's up to you, whatever you want to share. I'll just ask, who's older?
Oh, that's me. So I'm Ehsan, and I'd be older by only about a year and a half. But in terms of wisdom, I'm probably like a couple of decades beyond Shakil,
Right.
Don't appreciate that.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so what I received was the second book of the Wild Sun series, Unbound, but it doesn't make sense to start there. So let's start with the series as a whole. Can you give an overview of the series and the universe that it's set in?
Yes, I'll let you take the first attempt at that.
Sure. So the Wild Sun series begins with, so I should, I guess, just talk a little bit about how it's told. So each of the Wild Sun books is told from the perspective of three different characters. So in Wild Sun 1, or the beginning of Wild Sun, you start off with from the perspective of three distinct characters: Sarin, Sonus, and Beleric. Sarin and Sonus are both slaves or captives by an empire they barely sort of understand. They're just absolutely outgunned, outmanned, out technologied, and they're sort of natives to this planet that's been conquered and sort of not necessarily colonized, but they're essentially pillaging this off-world of their resources. And so there's just it's a very bleak existence for the slaves on the actual planet at that point. But there is just still this sort of glimmer of hope that they can, be freed potentially in some of the locals. And Srin is one of those people who really, she's part of a tribe called the Akobi, which come from the great forest within Corvos. The Corvos is the planet that's been conquered. So she really yearns to get back to that life. And then Sonus is an engineer that was in more of a city civilization type environment, more like in the industrial age of their growth and trajectory on the planet. And he had a life there, and he also longs to get to that, but is very much making do, or trying to make peace with his existence, just from a rational perspective, trying to understand that maybe this will end eventually. And Beleric is he's one of the planetary guard that's in charge of essentially from a security, taking care of security for the entire planet. But he's a grizzled war veteran. He's been around the block in sort of the Israeli, it was a Freudian slip, Vitari empire. And so he he's just basically trying to make do, trying to serve out the rest of his term on this sort of mission to just take resources off this planet. So it's very seemingly routine aspect of the Vitari military. The Vitari military. So the story basically plays out in, I won't say how it plays out per se, but each of these unique story arcs all intertwine to come to basically fruition by the end of book one. But what am I missing here, Shaq, on an overview?
No, I think you pretty much nailed it. It's I think the thing that folks pick up on mostly about Wild Sun 1 in particular, which 2 does also, pick up, is that the told from the multiple perspectives, right? And, Sarah, it was like very important to us to try and find some more gray area when we're talking about some headier topics like imperialism or, colonialism, even identity, within a particular race of peoples, et cetera, because, we have these, more Sonus, one of the main characters, comes from a more kind of advanced version for the planet, for Corvos, than the Akobi, where Sarin is a little bit more kind of, more native or tribal based, and then you have this empire, this mysterious empire that kind of descends upon them and is just, as Ehsan mentioned, is just kind of pillaging them for their natural resources. Again, another headier topic, right? And we just wanted to find that gray and be like, let's talk about these things. Let's show the other side as well, the folks, the pillagers, right? And see, like, maybe there is a rhyme or reason as to why they're doing that. So that, you have these anti-heroes, you have the more traditional hero or heroine setup as well, but, everyone's kind of interacting from different perspectives, essentially.
All right. Thank you both for that. What would you say was your initial inspiration for the series?
So you want to grab that one?
Sure, yeah. So I would say we're very enamored by the story of Jeanne d'Arc, or Joan of Arc. That was, I think, certainly our initial inspiration for Sarin, which is sort of the driving force, I'd say the real driving force for the narrative. I mean, she's just relentless, ambitious, but also vulnerable and weak, like very obviously believes in herself, but has very real world challenges that she has to overcome. And if you can imagine from Joan of Arc, I mean, which basically this nobody from a small town to go ultimately to lead the French military at a time where it was completely paternalistic and it defies imagination for that sort of ascent to occur. But really, throughout herself, always feeling and believing that could occur, just was extremely compelling. And then to do that from the perspective of a spiritual drive or some sort of abstract spiritual motivation to make that ascent was just really always gripping to us. So the question became is, what, can we sort of get that ethos and apply it to a character and put her in perhaps even more dire circumstance. We're really all about putting our characters to the test. So in all of the arcs, while we understand there's certain tropes that are very difficult to avoid, we wanted to make sure that every single character feels real and grounded, and that we're not kind of drifting too far out into kind of like a tropey sort of sci-fi plot. And this is really, really about the characters involved here. And Joan of Arc was just a great inspiration in that way. But who else am I missing, Shaq?
I mean, again, in terms of like inspiration wise, again, it goes to like a kind of a broader language of like storytelling and how we kind of came to it. I think we liked the Joan of Arc's story in particular because, as Ehsan mentioned, it's like the steepest mountain for anyone to like go from small village to leader of an empire to a certain extent, and with so much influence. Again, there's a bit of zealotry mixed in, and undeterred, like just singular vision. And I just think I always often wonder, like, how do we come to like appreciate these stories, or why do we like these stories? I think it has something to do with being kind of outsiders, having grown up, first generation immigrants, kind of outside looking in on American culture early on, and then obviously, I don't know if this is a bad word or a good word, but assimilating right into that culture by virtue of the arts in particular. And it has firstly taught me how important, art and storytelling is in general, right? And everyone has different versions of it, but they're more or less all very similar. Like the hero's journey is nothing new. It's inspiring, and there's a reason why underdogs persist. But the kind of more raw elements of the story, like why do we want our Surin in particular to just go through an incredible amount of turmoil, and why do we want to see her persevere? I think it has something to do with like kind of our own individual stories. But at the same time, there's these like flashes or arcs of not fantasy, but the implementation of like there's a god of battle that you come across early on, or at least the reference to the god of battle, Ikala, from Surin in an earlier chapter, frankly, the first chapter, right? And why we decided to infuse the story beyond just these, these real elements is, I think some of the larger, kind of more mystical pieces of it are also as kind of like exciting to us because partially of we were raised around religion, right? And there's this kind of like ethereal notion of existence, right? And always questioning these bigger questions, right? The more existential aspects of why we are here and what is our purpose. So infusing like the day-to-day grind alongside like these larger questions. And again, I Wild Sun really just embodies that. We didn't come into this story trying to tell these particular people's perspectives of, and again, like I said, like of being conquered and going through enslavement, but we're always sifting through as to why, doing some forensics as to why, but I'll kind of like stop talking for a second.
That seems like a good point to go take our first break of the podcast. I will say, upon re-listening to parts of this interview, that I really like the way the brothers work together and kind of pass the questions back and forth to each other. You can see that they work really well together, and maybe they're just on their best podcast behavior, but it's nice that they do that. Like I said, working with my brother, I love my brother dearly. We would not work well together. I don't know if we're too different or we're too similar, or maybe it's both at the same time, but we are sarcastic and sarcastic. I'm not sure it works so well. At any rate, let's go ahead and take our first break. When we come back, we'll be talking more about putting characters in stressful situations, because that's what makes good books. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast gives you advice on everything from hair to fashion to skincare products. We'll talk about the latest trends in makeup, hairstyles, and anti-aging remedies. And we'll cover all of the newest fashion trends. If you have an interest in or questions about the beauty trends that might work best for you, the Golden State Media Concepts Beauty Tips Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with authors Ehsan and Shakil Ahmad. I just conflated all three of their names right into one. Ehsan and Shakil Ahmad, about their Wild Sun series. Let's go ahead and return now to that interview.
You are like a lot of authors that I speak to, in that you put your characters through stuff. You put them through harrowing experiences, and that's just, why would we want to read about a main character or protagonist who is just, hanging out on their porch all day?
Exactly.
So in terms of Seren and Sonus, if each of you want to take one of those characters and say why you think they might resonate with readers.
Sure. Yeah. We'll do it on the fly. I'll take Sonus, and I'll give Ehsan Seren. So for Sonus, again, as you mentioned, these characters are going to go through some tremendous odds, very much stacked against them. Sonus became for us a bit more of a pragmatist. He's essentially a scientist, in his culture. And is really looking at the occupation, if you will, of this mysterious empire as something that is, if they just bear down, and just follow the rules, this too shall pass sort of thinking, right? And he's incredibly rational as a result of that, and does what he's told. He picks up some of the kind of the language of the invaders. He, even will somewhat work for them, right? Again, he's enslaved, but he gets some curry some favor by being able to work with some of the local technology or something. And so I think people would like Sonus in particular because he's not necessarily, his head's not in the clouds. He's really just trying to get through this with his wit and his intelligence, trying to get, understand, that it's really just a matter of time and and things can kind of normalize. And I think for a lot of us, sometimes we just need to go through, some crazy elements and bear down to be able to test ourselves and know that, hey, we are, it's not necessarily just, how do I put it? It's not just standing up doesn't always have to be fighting necessarily, right? I don't. So it's like, whereas maybe that's a good segue into Seren, Ehsan, if you want to take it from here.
Yeah, I mean, Sarin is a fighter. She's extremely determined to be free. Though she's not so foolhardy. I mean, she has some sense of practicality in her to know that she can't just lash out at any moment. She's outgunned. She knows that the odds are very much stacked against her. But she has that sort of a wit of a warrior. And yeah, she almost, there's also this like, she's a leader, but doesn't necessarily know it yet. She sees sort of how her people have, or just the people in her encampment accept their slavery or bondage as a bit of a weakness, even though there's really not much that they can do. But she just continues to believe that she can change her outcome and change her life and be in control of it. And that's, I think, something that can certainly resonate with others, right? But it's also a very lonely perspective that she is in. She's very much alone in that world, just tied and clinging to either her memories or her gods, which are her only connection to sort of this legacy, this old life that she used to have. So she's oddly layered in that way, where she's extremely alone in what she's trying to accomplish. No one will support her efforts because she's a bit of a troublemaker in that way, right? She's just like she's getting everyone in trouble in terms of her attempts to escape. But she just will always persist because she believes that she is, she's motivated by something divine. And so, yeah, I mean, in that way, we felt that that's eminently relatable in that she really feels like she is I don't know, she's like taking her own life and her own story in her own hands. So just a very compelling from that perspective.
Okay. And then how do you feel? Well, actually, I'll save that for a later part of the conversation. In terms of character development, do you like to have a really good, clear picture of each character before you start writing? Do characters kind of develop more as you write? How do you handle character development?
Yeah, I mean, we're big on like scaffolding, and we assign basically, like, one of our methods I'll go through. Like we basically start off with describing each of the characters in 5 words, like basically, simplify it down to 5 words to start. And then we build on those 5 words into, a bit of a history for each one. So we'll write an individual history. We'll write a history of the entire world. Then we'll put some context to their existence in that world, in that environment. And then we really just always start to, so we'll basically take the marble out of the mountain in terms of the world we're creating, and then chip away at each of the characters to continue to understand them and not necessarily define them, but you define them to a degree to get started writing, because then they set about creating their own definition and their own identities that way, right? So an interesting point is when we jumped from book 1 to book 2, it was a lot harder to tell the characters what we wanted them to be, because they now had a bit of their own agency based on the decisions they had made in the previous narrative. So you're not to say that you're boxed in that way, but you're listening as more so than telling what a character to be. So yeah, but we do a heavy bit of prep. I mean, we're just like Shakil mentioned, we didn't know what we were doing to begin with, so we just prioritized trying to develop as much of a backstory and understanding of our characters before we set pen to page on the first book.
Also, in terms of world building, because you do have a new world to us, how much world building did you do before we started writing?
Yeah, it's funny because we often remark upon this. The Wild Sun, really a universe at this point, started as a backstory for a character in a screenplay, right? It tells you the extent to which you can take, like Ehsan mentioned, that kind of simple scaffolding, a 5 word, very basic approach and expound upon it into like just a massive world. So when we came to the world building, we were working on a screenplay, and one of the backstories ended up on the planet of Corvus. And again, actually, the screenplay was set on Earth, you know, so this is kind of like an interstellar thing. And then Corvus was developed, but it was in particular, we started with the idea of Sonus and like enslaved in a camp, and trying to figure out his surroundings. And then when we looked at larger pieces of Corvus, we wanted multiple factions across that, you know, so there wasn't just us against them, right? That black-white kind of contrast insofar as the storytelling aspect of it. It would be like, hey, there's multiple factions on Corvus, plus there's this invading kind of force that's coming along. So it's not going to be as simple as like pushing against that force. And then when it came to some of the more basic elements, like this is going to be an advanced, you know, invading force naturally, right? Coming to someone who's, you know, less advanced, but in their own eyes, like meaning Sonus and Seren specifically, they were happy living their versions of their world. Obviously, these are like multiple worlds colliding, and a lot of the world building came from looking at just from a 15,000 foot view of what we saw in terms of like other science fiction stories. Sometimes we liked it's wonderful to kind of really get a breath of a new world, but we didn't focus too much of going too wide in terms of that development. We really focused a lot of the development on the character development, and the world was obviously a character in and of itself, but I think we want to just make sure. Yeah, go ahead, Son.
Let me just add to that, because in terms of, there's certainly a scope there. So it's like, the planet itself, right? We wrote an environment for it. What are the resources on it? Is it fresh water? Is it mostly ocean? There's 5 different clans that, or groups or tribes that inhabit on the planet, right? So you've got the Polanians, the Akobi, Kanasans, Batal, all these folks, we wrote backstories for, or at least characteristics of, right? The Kanasans come from the south of the continent. They're nomadic. They have a few large permanent settlements. The Akobi are like ancient people who dwelt in that great forest for millennia, basically. And then we just wrote all of these aspects of all the different inhabiting tribes and civilizations, how they interact and connect with each other, because all the characters were born out of that history. So there's a rich kind of historical fiction that we've written around before, that the characters lived in before they lived in our story. And the same thing we did for the Vitar. So rather than make our villains one-dimensional, or villains, so to speak, but antagonists one-dimensional, we wrote about what are the struggles on the Vitari planet, what's the hierarchy there, what's the social strata, how do they get ahead? It's obviously very militaristic, it's dictatorial, and then all of this to the point of creating depth in all of on both sides of this conflict. And then that leads up to the backstory for the invasion. So there was an invasion on the planet, obviously. And how did each of these groups have to deal with that, or what did they go throughout that invasion? And then the story picks up, basically several years after the invasion. There is like, the world needs to feel real. And though a lot of our backstory doesn't necessarily make it onto the page, the right elements do, to make sure that we're tying into this like deeper lore that we're exploring in not only future books but other aspects of spinning off into the Wild Sun universe.
Time for that second break of the podcast. I will say that I am always amazed and in awe of how authors put together the backstory of their characters and their universe, regardless of the setting or the genre of that universe, just the details that they have to keep straight that may or may not make it onto the page, but that they need to know in order to bring those characters and the story fully to life. And so I love that Ehsan and Shakil have an encyclopedia that they can refer to that I think is awesome. I would actually read that. I would read the encyclopedia because I'm a dork like that. But let's go ahead and take that break. When we come back, we'll be talking about specific research done for the series. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with authors Shakil and Ahmad about their their Wild Sun series. I want to apologize for any background noise you may hear. I am, as you know, not in my normal studio. I am in my niece's bedroom, in my 15-year-old niece's bedroom, and the 10-year-old niece apparently has not yet learned not to slam doors on a regular basis. So she just went in and out of the bathroom like 6 times and slammed the door each time. So my apologies for that. But she's just so cute. I can't hold it against her. At any rate, let's go ahead and get back to the interview.
Then in terms of research, what kinds of research did you do? Because it is science fiction. So, it's not... like with fantasy, you have a little more leeway sometimes with magic, but with science fiction, the science needs to be there to a certain extent. So what kinds of research did you do for the series?
We tried to marry the story in as much as basically away from lasers and mages and things like that. We're very much in ballistics and practical things, stuff we can kind of have a grounding in. It was just to basically make sure that, the weapons that we used made sense in the world and in the universe. Tactics, military tactics, how would we go about that? The animal, the flora, fauna, what would make sense in an environment like Corvos that we've created. Behaviors, accents, languages, things like that. We just, any of those aspects just had their own research associated with it. And we tried to, as much, we understand our audience or a sci-fi audience can be pretty discerning when it comes to the technical details. So we, as much as we could, we tried to just really look into anything that was particularly technical. But a lot of it was around military strategy of our invading force, practical elements of running a mine. So our slaves are housed on massive mines that go into the mines every day. So what is that like? What are the realistic elements? How do you move minerals, large minerals in and out of dark caverns and things like that? What kind of equipment is used, drills and all those things? Is it, how long can people survive in these mines? All those things we had to look into using analogs and coal mining and all those traditional things. So yeah, there's certainly a high level of research that went into all the different elements to make it feel like a real world. We definitely weren't playing it by ear, basically. We definitely weren't playing it by ear.
Yeah, we like Ehsan mentioned, it's very grounded. So we envisioned it like kind of like an Earth-like place, humanoid-like characters, right? We even developed, Sarah, at some point, an entire encyclopedia, essentially, which we have of all the people's, places, things in particular. So it was really cool because we just like consistency in storytelling as well. So particularly as you mentioned, like you can go anywhere with this, right? But we feel like we have an obligation to not just go anywhere. That I think that's the most important thing is when you're putting pen to paper is like you're going somewhere, like, and it has to make sense, right? Just from character motivations to why, as Ehsan mentioned, a drill bot might be floating around in a mine or something, right? We rooted it in ballistics and in military convention for the more kind of like warfare like aspects of the story. But in terms of the world building stuff, even though it doesn't make the page, we just have these massive spreadsheet encyclopedias of things that were implemented into the story, and if we were to continue on with the story, that, okay, hey, we mentioned this style of, let's say, canister, right? Well, if we're going to use a canister in book 2, then we're just not going to make up another canister style, right? That we have this already existing on the world. So it's very important to create these breadcrumbs, throughout the process. And that can be very daunting at first because, hey, you're creating a world, but at the same time, your world is, obviously half your imagination, but also what you see and what you've lived and your own experiences. So it's an amalgamation of these two things. And our best approach at it was, hey, let's just put it all down, even more mundane elements of it, and then obviously the things that are more exciting, let's get those on the page. But let's fill in the blanks with some of the more basic elements, so it feels like a very rich and real world.
Okay. I love the concept of an encyclopedia. That's just something that you will always have, even if no one ever sees it, that you guys makes a lot of sense to have that written down.
Yep.
What about the genre of sci-fi do you think draws you to write in that genre?
Yeah, I mean, we love it. I mean, we love drama, and then drama sci-fi even better. And I think a large part of that is just imagining another version of the world that you're living in. And like I said, it probably touches upon some of our upbringing and our place in the world. And, you have all these freedoms, right, to create another world. But at the same time, you can take it, if you take it seriously is the wrong word, because there's other sci-fi authors and artists that do that. But the way we take it is, let's just infuse very light dusting of sci-fi, right, onto a character-driven story. So we like some of the elements of science fiction about creating the planet and the other races, but when you really look at the story, it's a very common story insofar as it's been told throughout all of human civilization, right? This kind of impossible odds hero's journey, enslavement, collision of different civilizations, and just lightly dusting, some of the sci-fi elements onto it so that we can play on, as Ehsan often will put it, some of these more tectonic shifts of what's happening in our world, right? We touch on those, like Ehsan mentioned, some of the, we have factions obviously on Corvos, but then we have the families on Vitar, some of the clans, if you will, that we built out that allow us to kind of play in the sandbox of science fiction, but at the same time really stay down into a character-driven story. So I'll let you kind of like maybe pick that up if you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, science fiction in general just is, to us, or to me, certainly equals freedom. I mean, we can tackle pretty complex issues political issues, third rail issues, things like colonization, empire, slavery. I did, in terms of, femininity, what that means, what it means to be rational, and how to solve complex problems in like a non-black and white world, right? And in terms of like what's right and wrong. So sci-fi just allows us to create analogs to our real world in a freeing way, which and allows us to say things and do things and write things, and allows our characters a freedom that you wouldn't necessarily have in the real world. So it's not necessarily an escapism type thing, but it's more like just a freedom to express ideas and thoughts in a way that that makes you think, or hopefully makes our readers think and at least consider. But we never get too caught up in that. In terms of the statements we're trying to make, we're not really trying to make a statement. It's more so, can we make these characters feel real? And being able to write in the science fiction genre allows us to sort of suspend some of the limitations that we have writing in, like, let's say, a nonfiction book or something like this. So yeah, I'm obviously a big fan of science fiction and how it allows us to stretch our minds more so than other genres.
Okay. Now, moving on to the second book, Unbound, what can you say about that book? It's always fun to talk about series, because you don't want to give too much away from a first book for people who haven't read it, but you do want to talk about the second book. So what can you say about this second book and what's going on with the story and the characters?
So the Unbound kind of obviously follows Seren, Sonus, and Valeric through, but we add a different perspective into it to freshen it up a little bit. And, I'm trying to say how much Unbound is kind of written into the title, right? Unbound. So we talked about slavery and enforced labor camps, etc. So you can imagine, hey, we're slightly, there's a little more glimmer of hope. That hope, that was a glint, is a little bit more of perhaps a ray of light that's kind of compelling these characters to move forward. So they've had small victories, right? I mean, again, it's very grounded. So you're not just going to overcome some incredibly advanced, empire. So it's the small little things, and that might just be essentially breaking your shackles, essentially, right? It's not necessarily exploding their headquarters or something, their main ship or something to that effect. So it's really just taking it from that little small victory and seeing how they can stay focused and together in one common and united goal of, like, what is this next step to the next small victory? Because, it's these smaller things that often resonate with us the most, because I'm not going to get into it right now with Ehsan, particularly on the line about like Marvel storytelling, but, the odds do not have to always be right. It's save the world to, you have to save the world. It doesn't have to be that. It has to be, I need to get out of, this one particular place to this other place, and how do I do that? And Unbound really, stays in that kind of vibe of like small victories, moving forward towards something greater. We're not sure what that is yet, right? Because the characters are evolving just as much as the world around them is, because a colonized space has a lot of tension built into it at all times, because there's revolts, there's just an immense amount of pressure based on the resources that are being drained out of the society, whether that's natural resources or just the culture or the or anything like that. So it's just one small step towards something that they're not sure, but you can feel it kind of building towards something larger in scope, which we're excited to continue to build upon, because we were excited. And again, I'm not saying that we're comparing it necessarily, but one of the influences, and it kind of goes back to your previous question, Sarah, like the Matrix, science fiction. But for us, like one of our influences was we come from the generation where the Matrix is a quintessential kind of iconic science fiction film that, in our opinions, right, definitely changed things up a little bit, and told a very tight story, all things considered, in the first one in particular. And then again, they kept building, right? And then you got Reloaded, and then you had Revolutions. And again, some people don't even count those movies. So sometimes when you go bigger from a small story, it doesn't necessarily amount to what it was, what folks had hoped. And we're very cognizant of that. And that's why we're trying to stay kind of rooted. But it follows the story of Sarin, Sonus, and the principal characters, and like I said, a fresh perspective or two to show where the kind of like where the struggle is, but it's more of a chase element brought into it, as opposed to, hey, more methodical thinking about how to break away. Like, let's imagine us now on the run, sort of. I don't want to, Ehsan, do you want to chime in there on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you pretty much got quite a bit of it. The only things I would add is that we expound a little bit more on the Batari Empire, what their motivations are, and give a little more detail into how they operate, why they're operating, and sort of what's motivating them to be on Corvus. And also in terms of the dynamics between now Sarin and Sonus in particular, their decision making has now much higher consequence. Obviously, the highest consequence. So they have to work out dynamics both between themselves and sort of their the people they're collaborating with and working with in very, very tense scenarios and situations with limited time to make those decisions. So, and they have like I said, reverberating consequences beyond just themselves at this point. Whereas in book one, it was very much like, everyone was on their solo journey. And in book two, it's very much a dynamic amongst the group. So just a different perspective. I mean, we have all three novels, like this whole trajectory plotted out, and we're making good progress towards where I think initially, at least in the direction of where we wanted to land, in terms of how the arcs will ultimately play out. But we've explored, through those dynamics, those group dynamics, we've explored some interesting aspects of each of the characters, which I think are going to be interesting for those folks who really enjoyed book one.
Time for the last break of the podcast. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. As a quick reminder, before the break, we were talking about, the overall arc and the storyline and the number of books in the series, and so that comes into play because of where we pick up. So just so you're not being dropped into the middle of that conversation.
Well, Ehsan, you just did my job for me, because I was going to ask about the arc and the number of books. I know on your website it says a 3-book series, and you're feeling like you're gonna hit that 3-book arc and not need another book. A lot of times, sci-fi and fantasy authors, they say they're gonna do 2 or 3 books, but then it turns into like 10.
Yeah, I think, and you're not totally off on that. Meaning, like, the latter half of that comment was because we're now we've branched out into some interesting projects around in the Wild Sun universe, and we're actually involved in one right now, so the original intention, to your point, was to write 3 books, right? So a trilogy that we can, and planned arcs over that trilogy. And we're still very much in our sort of the main canon or that main trilogy, planning to do that. Now what we've done is that we are now exploring, or basically about to publish, and have been working on a backstory novella. So a novella based around one of the main characters from book 1 of Wild Sun. So we're expanding out the Wild Sun universe sooner than we thought we would. But we felt like we have a very compelling sort of backstory to tell in one of the characters. In this case, it would be Beleric. And so we're basically going to go back to some of Beleric's formative days and how he came to be the soldier and the person that he is in the Vitari military, and give a little more insight into his decision making. So things are starting to branch out for us in the Wild Sun universe, and we really do envision this to be much larger, and the scope to be much larger. And in this case, we're choosing to go backwards to tell more story.
Okay, makes sense. How does the writing process work between the two of you? I'm always fascinated by co-authors and how they kind of divvy up the writing. This is a sibling situation, and I'm trying to picture writing anything with my brother, and it would not work. So speak to how you write together, and specifically how you write together as siblings.
Yeah. I mean, listen, it didn't work at first, I'll tell you that. But we figured out a way. We touched on a little bit earlier, right? So we're brothers, obviously. We know each other, incredibly well. And we happen to, and fortunately, I suppose, have very similar influences growing up, artistic influences from, I'm slightly younger, but, if Ehsan was listening to a band or something, and the CD was laying around, yes, CDs, I might be like, I might take the CD and listen to it myself. Like I'm thinking of like Bush in particular, right? Comes to mind, that, I don't know if you know the band, kind of that grungy band out of right. And so I fell in love with that band, and, similar influences, and it allows you, when you have that sort of just unspoken common language, it's hard to describe. I can sometimes look at Ehsan and if something, and we could start laughing about something, right? Where a lot of people from the outside looking in have like no idea like why it's so funny, and we may not know why it's funny because again, it's just an intrinsic, value system, art system, every system, right? That we just kind of are tied into together as siblings. We also were raised in a particular way to always make sure that that we cared for one another, even though we obviously were siblings and brothers no less, and we have an eldest brother. We got into plenty of fights, but it was our parents were very keen on ensuring that we always had each other's back, right? So no matter what, we always resolved differences, and that kind of very simple kind of element of being raised that way allowed us to, when we got into the initial throes of writing Wild Sun, right? And again, not being classically trained, writers, what we were doing is just, at first, Ehsan really developed the backstory. So Ehsan did the initial exposition of the world and the story, and I was working on something slightly different in terms of like a screenplay concept, and we figured, hey, why don't we just collaborate together? We were living our separate lives, and sometimes life will lead you back to certain people, and he had this kind of idea, and then when we started to try and write together, well, that got very difficult because we do have different sensibilities. Yes, we have similar influences, but when it comes to particularly art or direction and style to a certain aspect, we have different styles. And so, it was like large chunks of what Ehsan had created in terms of the world building, and then trying to just break that down into different sections of dialogue. But we would often do that together early on. be in a room together, one of us pacing, another one at a computer, kind of writing certain prose elements of the prose, and then getting into the dialogue heavy stuff, which Ehsan would kind of take over. But I'll let you chime in on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, you pretty much got it. It was, I think the key aspect of collaboration in our case was prioritizing alignment as much as we could up front. So, and then chunking. So we would take you take an entire summary, like a treatment, and then you expand that out into, chapter synopses, right? So it's like we're understanding each chapter, where we're trying to go, the major points we want to hit to ensure that everything's moving along appropriately. And then basically we would write a chunk between the two of us, and then come back and evaluate and revise, and always checking to make sure we're ensuring continuity, make sure our arcs make sense, make sure there's enough world building and, actual interest in this stuff. So that people are, to make sure that it's interesting, compelling, make sure our dialogue was compelling. And because we were first-time authors, it was almost a benefit, because we're just we're just being extremely careful and ensuring that, what we're writing is actually interesting. So yeah, I mean, it sounds a little, in theory, I think in the idea of brothers working together sounds pretty interesting and awesome. And then, in practicality, it was very I won't say uninteresting certainly, but it's very straightforward in the way you would imagine it. Just going back and forth, keeping open lines of communication, being able to work out and resolve sort of major sticking points by giving charity to the other person's idea, listening, actively listening, and then allowing the best ideas to come forward. And then one of us would just sit down and basically put words to paper, and then together we just kept sculpting that and creating momentum to the point where we were able to get 90,000 words down and write the book.
All right. And you said that you're working on a sort of prequel novella sort of thing right now. Are you working on anything else together?
Yes, actually, we are working on something called the Wild Sun Collective. So this for us is going to be a very unique project. We believe it's actually a unique project in all of publishing. I know that's a very strong claim to make, but I think folks who check out what the Wild Sun Collective is up to will understand what we're trying to get out. But in short, from the perspective of a Wild Sun fan, it is a novella, which is a backstory, which we are looking to publish through a very non-traditional medium.
Okay. Thank you for that. We are, kind of getting on in the interview. So what advice would you have for aspiring authors?
Yeah, Ehsan touched on it. I mean, it's not particularly romantic, like cabin in the woods and cigars and typewriters and and scotch, right?
There's some of that.
There's definitely, yeah. Well, we're not the productive type that's more ideation, if you will. When it gets down to the writing, it's like you said, it's a lot of scheduling. You gotta honor the time. Time is a luxury now more than ever, particularly it being pulled in multiple directions by virtue of social media, work and personal lives. There's just the digital environment is always grasping for it. So it's on a Google Calendar saying, hey, for these 2 hours, and actually not chunking too much time, believe it or not. You only have so much, or at least I'm a big proponent of the idea that your every day is kind of like a battery, right? And sleep is that kind of charging cycle. You only have so much. You have finite time to be, to be most productive and creative. That's coincidentally, unfortunately for us, our morning time. And so we would chunk out that time, commit to just moving it forward just a little bit. And it didn't have to. And sometimes you have off days, right? It's like working out or something where I've been working out for 4 weeks and I get all these gains, or I feel great. and then for some reason you're plateauing, and it's okay to plateau. It's a necessary aspect of it, actually. You can't see the horizon as well, as when you're kind of like moving upward, but it helps you appreciate those moments when you start to get some rubber hitting the road elements to the story, and like, okay, like, hey, I don't have to hit a home run. I need to just honor the arcs that I need to kind of say, like, hey, what we did prior to this matters, and let's just stick to it, and then iterate on that, and like look back a little bit and iterate on that. That kind of breadcrumbs and chunking time, I think, matters a lot. Ehsan, I don't know if you want to jump in.
I mean, there's probably not novel advice here, no pun intended, but it's just, the idea that, good stories aren't written, they're rewritten. So you get the ideas out there and then start to revise and really continue to put thought and refine them. It's okay to sort of make mistakes. There's obviously things we were done looking back on Wild Sun. We're obviously tremendously proud of the accomplishment, but you're always looking back and saying, oh, I could have done this or I could have done that. Made subtle adjustments here, that sort of thing. But you have to kind of just sometimes make a decision to move forward. And perfection can be the enemy in that case. It's very much what Shakil was saying, is keep plugging away, keep those ideas going, and be prepared to fail a lot, both in terms of the actual writing of the story and or trying to get people to either like it, to understand it, to engage with it from a publisher perspective, that sort of thing. It's a long journey, and a lot of it really depends on your intention. So the last thing I would say is don't take advice from anyone.
Yes.
Okay, so just disregard the last few minutes.
Yeah,
exactly.
The last 60 minutes.
I know you have a website, so if you could tell people the website as well as where they can interact with you on social media.
Yeah, the website is thewildsun.com. Ehsan mentioned the Wild Sun Collective, which is this kind of cool coming soon. So that's wildsuncollective.com. And then our handle for Twitter and Instagram is the Ahmad Bros. And we're particularly active right now on Twitter, so you can find a lot about what's going on with the Wild Sun Collective in particular there. And then we're Uproar Books. I got to shout out Rick. He did a great job in shepherding us along as first-time authors, and really appreciate what Rick Lewis at Uproar Books was able to do. So you can find us there too.
Publisher.
UproarBooks.com.
That actually reminds me, can you talk a little bit about the cover art? Who designed it? How much say did you have in it?
Yeah, we went the first time around. It was actually a friend, a digital artist, that Ehsan knew, and Kirill Pashkov. Actually, I don't. You can Google him. I'm not sure of his website, but he does some really great concept art. And we went kind of watercolor pastelish vibe for that cover art, and then we teamed up with a publicist at some point, and we're writing a forward for a relaunch of book one, because book two was launched during the pandemic, and so we wanted some extra little freshening up for book one, and we worked with Lance Buckley, lancebuckley.com, great also a digital artist that works with authors quite a bit for covers in particular, and he did a great job of envisioning Surin and some of the broader elements of the Wild Sun story. So that's Lance Buckley, and we're actually collaborating with him for something on the Wild Sun Collective as well. So.
All right, perfect. Well, we have talked about a variety of things during our time together, but is there anything that we haven't covered that either of you were hoping to be able to highlight or bring up during the interview?
Nothing I can think of other than to say thank you for being on the podcast. We're just very excited. We obviously listened to a few episodes prior. Just a real big fan of yours, Sarah, and what you do. So thank you again for letting us on.
Well, thank you for that. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you again for your time. Really appreciate it. And just excited for, what's to come. We got some really, really, really neat stuff coming up with the collective. And I think I'm really just excited. We can't talk too much about it now, but yeah, it's going to be pretty cool. So stay tuned.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me know, when new things come out, and if my schedule is, if my schedule allows, I would love to have you back.
Oh, awesome. Oh, we'd love that. Yeah, that would be great. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you once again to Ehsan and Shakil for joining me. I mentioned to them that I wish we had done a video aspect of this interview, because I normally just do audio and that works out okay, especially since it's the weekend. Tend to interview in my PJs, but I guess I could still do that. It's only from the shoulders up. But anyway, it would have been nice to see who had been speaking, because it was sometimes not always easy to differentiate who was speaking. And it just would have been nice to see and know who was pausing to take a breath or to keep talking or whatever. But, live and learn. I can do that next time. I really want to thank the Ahmad brothers for joining me for this interview to talk about the Wild Sun series. I love the thoughtfulness that they put into answering all the questions, as well as into their writing and in creating this universe and these characters. You can tell that it's an exercise of love, and that they really enjoy doing it, and that they enjoy doing it together. So very appreciative of that, and appreciative of them for joining me. Again, the first book is called Wild Sun, and the second book is called Unbound. Both are available now, so you can get those and read them together, which is always good. You'll still have to wait for the third one, but you can read the first two together and not have to wait in between, at least for those. And then there is that short story coming up, or novella, so you can read a little bit more about this universe. I hope that you enjoyed this interview. I hope that you will join me again for the next interview, when I will have another returning author coming back. Kim Taylor Blakemore joined me the first time to talk about her novel, The Companion. This time we'll be talking about her new novel, After Alice Fell. So join me for that. Kim's a lot of fun to talk to, and I'm really looking forward to that. If you are a fan of this podcast, please, as I always ask, write a review. Give us a starred review or write a review. Either one helps. We just want to get this podcast out to as many book lovers as possible. You can also follow the podcast on social media. GSMC Book Review on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can interact with me. You can ask me questions. You can talk about what you're reading. I really love hearing from readers, so please do follow on social media as well as interact on social media. That would be awesome. I hope you're having a great week. I hope that there is something in this week that has brought you joy, and that the weekend ahead will bring you even more joy. I can already tell you that I have had an infinite amount of joy already in this week, and that will continue as I continue spending time with my family over the next little while as I am home. So I am so very, very blessed to be here with them. I haven't been home in 2 years, so everyone has grown. The 10-year-old is almost as tall as I am. I'm really not thrilled with that. Rude. But the 15-year-old is the shortest of us all, and will continue to be so. So I feel both smug and sad for her. But I'm going to soak up every moment and enjoy it as much as I can. I hope that you have something like that as well. If you do, wonderful, or, but regardless of what you are doing this week or this weekend, I hope that you can find plenty of time to get lost in a good book. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.